When Laura confesses to Nick that she had an affair with her friend Caitlin in college, his world is shaken. But when Caitlin unexpectedly shows up at their home in the Chicago suburbs, secrets of the past resurface and temptations become dangerous. Will Nick resist betrayal, or will his thirst for revenge destroy everything? Subscribe to find out how this drama will unfold. In a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, Nick Harper sat in the cozy living room of his two-story home, flipping through blueprints for a new residential project. At 35, he was a rising architect, known for his clean designs and steady demeanor. The soft hum of evening settled over the house, mingling with the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, where his wife, Laura, was preparing dinner. Married for 10 years, Nick and Laura had built a life that felt solid, shared dreams, a mortgage, and a rhythm that worked. No kids yet, but they talked about it sometimes when the moment felt right. Nick adjusted his glasses, his focus drifting from the blueprints. Something about the day felt off, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the long hours at the firm, or maybe it was the way Laura had been distracted lately, her phone buzzing more than usual. He pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to his imagination. Dinner's almost ready, Laura called from the kitchen, her voice light, but carrying an edge Nick couldn't quite place. She stepped into the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. At 35, Laura was striking, blonde hair pulled into a loose bun, green eyes that sparkled when she smiled. She worked as a marketing consultant, her sharp mind always juggling campaigns and clients. Tonight, though, her smile seemed forced. "Hey, Nick," she said, leaning against the frame. "I forgot to mention earlier, my old college friend Caitlin is coming to stay with us for a few days. She's in town for work and didn't want to splurge on a hotel." Nick looked up, his pen pausing over the blueprint. "Caitlin." The name didn't ring a bell. "Don't think you've ever talked about her." Laura's laugh was quick, almost too quick. "Oh, come on, I must have mentioned her. We were super close at the University of Illinois. She's great, you'll like her. Always full of energy." She turned back to the kitchen before Nick could ask more, her movements brisk, like she was dodging follow-up questions. Nick frowned, a faint unease settling in his chest. Laura wasn't one to keep secrets, but her vagueness about this friend felt odd. He set the blueprints aside and stood, stretching his arms. "Need help with dinner?" he called, more to shake off the feeling than anything else. "Nope, I've got it," Laura replied, her voice muffled as she rummaged through a cabinet. "Just relax. It's been a long week." Nick wandered to the window, peering out at the neatly trimmed lawn glowing under the streetlights. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where people waved at each other and kids rode bikes until dusk. He loved the life they'd carved out. So why did Laura's announcement make him feel like a stranger was about to disrupt it? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just a friend visiting, nothing more. Still, he decided to make the weekend special. Maybe a nice dinner, some wine, a chance to get to know this Caitlin. If she was important to Laura, she'd be important to him too. He grabbed his phone and texted his coworker, Mike, asking for a recommendation on a good local butcher. A proper roast could set the tone for a warm welcome. As he waited for Mike's reply, Nick's mind wandered back to Laura. They'd met 12 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue, bonding over burnt burgers and shared love of old jazz records. She'd been upfront about her past, her small-town upbringing, her college years, even a few ex-boyfriends. But Caitlin? Nick racked his brain, trying to recall any mention of her. Nothing came up. It wasn't like Laura to leave out someone she described as super close. The oven timer beeped, snapping him out of his thoughts. Laura appeared again, carrying a steaming dish of lasagna to the dining table. "Food's ready," she said, her smile brighter now, though her eyes darted to her phone as it lit up with a notification. She silenced it quickly and gestured for Nick to sit. They ate mostly in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't quite comfortable either. Nick tried to make small talk about his latest project, a community center downtown, but Laura's responses were short, her attention elsewhere. When he mentioned Caitlin again, asking what she did for work, Laura waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, she's in event planning or something like that. Always on the move. You know how it is." She took a sip of water, her gaze fixed on the table. Nick nodded, but the unease grew. Why was she so cagey? He didn't want to push, not when she seemed stressed, but the question lingered like a splinter. After dinner, he helped clear the plates, watching Laura as she moved around the kitchen. She was humming softly, a habit she fell into when she was nervous. Nick wanted to ask more, to understand why this visit felt like a bigger deal than she was letting on, but he held back. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe Caitlin was just a friend, and Laura's distraction was work-related. Later, as they settled on the couch to watch a movie, Nick's phone buzzed with Mike's reply. "Try Anderson's on Maple. Best cuts in town." Nick smiled, already planning the menu. He'd make this weekend perfect, not just for Caitlin, but for Laura too. Whatever was bothering her, he'd show her they were still a team. But as Laura curled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Caitlin's arrival, however innocent it seemed, was a thread pulled loose in the fabric of their life. And once pulled, he wasn't sure what might unravel. The Chicago evening was cool and crisp, the kind that made the suburbs feel like a postcard. Nick stood at the kitchen counter, slicing vegetables for a welcome dinner, the rhythmic chop of the knife grounding him. Laura had left an hour ago to pick up Caitlin from Union Station, and the house felt too quiet without her. Nick's mind churned with questions about this college friend who'd appeared out of nowhere. Laura's vague answers last night hadn't helped, and the more he thought about it, the more her secrecy gnawed at him. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. Tonight, he'd be the perfect host, and maybe Caitlin would fill in the blanks Laura seemed reluctant to touch. The front door swung open, and Laura's laughter spilled into the house, followed by another voice, warm, confident, with a hint of a drawl. Nick wiped his hands on a dish towel and stepped into the hallway, his curiosity piqued. Laura stood there, her cheeks flushed from the chilly air, next to a woman who could only be Caitlin. She was taller than Nick expected, with chestnut hair cascading over her shoulders and a smile that seemed to light up the room. Her presence was magnetic, like she owned every space she entered. "Nick, this is Caitlin," Laura said, her voice bright but tinged with something Nick couldn't place. Nervousness, maybe? "Caitlin, my husband, Nick." Caitlin extended a hand, her grip firm, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him pause. "So, you're the guy who stole Laura's heart," she said, her tone teasing but warm. "Nice to finally meet you." "Likewise," Nick replied, managing a smile. "Hope you're hungry. I'm throwing together a roast." "Starving," Caitlin said, her smile widening as she shrugged off her coat. "Laura's been hyping up your cooking skills." Nick glanced at Laura, who was busy hanging up her scarf, avoiding his gaze. He led them to the dining room, where the table was set with care, candles, a bottle of red wine, the good plates. Caitlin's easy chatter filled the space as they settled in, recounting stories of late-night study sessions and college pranks at the University of Illinois. Laura laughed along, her eyes sparkling in a way Nick hadn't seen in weeks. He tried to join in, but something about their dynamic made him feel like an outsider, like he was watching a play he hadn't been cast in. Dinner was a hit, the roast tender, the wine smooth, but the conversation took an unexpected turn as Caitlin poured herself a second glass. "Remember that party at Sigma Chi, Laura?" she said, leaning back in her chair, her voice dripping with nostalgia. "The one where you dragged me onto the dance floor and whispered you were crazy about me." Nick's fork froze midair. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick. He looked at Laura, whose smile faltered for a split second before she recovered, letting out a nervous laugh. "Oh God, Caitlin, you're digging up ancient history," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "We were kids." Nick's heart thudded. "Wait, what?" he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "You two dated?" Laura's eyes flicked to his, and for a moment, she looked caught, like a deer in headlights. "It was nothing serious, Nick," she said quickly. "Just a college thing, experimenting. It was over before I met you." Caitlin raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a half-smile that felt almost provocative. "Oh, come on, Laura. It wasn't that insignificant," she said, her tone playful but laced with something sharper. "We had some good times." Nick's stomach twisted. He forced a smile, trying to keep his composure, but the revelation hit like a sucker punch. Laura had never mentioned dating a woman, let alone someone she was crazy about. Why had she kept this from him? And why was Caitlin bringing it up now, in their home, with that knowing look in her eyes? The rest of the meal passed in a blur. Laura steered the conversation to safer topics. Work, Chicago's brutal winters, but Nick's mind was elsewhere. He watched Caitlin, who seemed to revel in the tension she'd stirred, her glances lingering on Laura a beat too long. Laura, for her part, laughed a little too loudly, her fingers fidgeting with her napkin. Nick tried to focus on the food, the wine, anything to anchor himself, but questions swirled in his head. Was there more to this story? Was Caitlin here to rekindle something? After dessert, Caitlin offered to help clear the table, and Nick found himself alone with her in the kitchen while Laura stepped outside to take a work call. Caitlin stacked plates in the sink, her movements casual, but there was a deliberateness to her presence that set Nick on edge. "So, Nick," she said, turning to face him, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Laura never told you about us." "Huh? That's interesting." Nick's jaw tightened. "Guess it didn't come up," he said, keeping his tone neutral as he scrubbed a pan. Caitlin leaned against the counter, her eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite read. Amusement? Challenge? "She's always been good at keeping secrets," she said, her words hanging in the air like a dare. "But don't worry. I'm just here to catch up, not cause trouble." Nick met her gaze, his unease deepening. "Good to know," he said, but the words felt hollow. Caitlin's smile widened, and for a moment, he felt like she could see right through him, like she knew exactly how much her words had shaken him. Laura returned, breaking the moment, and the three of them settled in the living room for coffee. But the atmosphere had shifted. Nick watched Laura and Caitlin, their easy banter now tinged with subtext he couldn't ignore. Every laugh, every glance felt loaded, and he couldn't shake the sense that Caitlin's arrival was no accident. As the night wound down and Caitlin headed upstairs to the guest room, Nick caught Laura's hand, searching her face for answers. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but searching. Laura nodded, her smile strained. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day." Nick wanted to press, to ask why she'd never told him about Caitlin, why this felt like more than a casual visit. But something in her eyes stopped him, a flicker of guilt or maybe fear. He let it go, for now, but as they climbed the stairs to bed, the weight of the evening settled over him like a storm cloud. Caitlin's words echoed in his mind. She's always been good at keeping secrets. Nick lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what else Laura hadn't told him, and what Caitlin's presence would unravel next. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the Harper household, casting soft stripes across the hardwood floors. Nick sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside. Laura and Caitlin were still upstairs, likely sleeping in after last night's late conversation. Nick's mind, however, was wide awake, replaying Caitlin's words from the kitchen. She's always been good at keeping secrets. The revelation of Laura's college romance with Caitlin had left him reeling, but it was Caitlin's insinuating tone, her knowing smile, that kept him up most of the night. He glanced at the staircase, half expecting to hear footsteps. Part of him wanted to confront Laura, to demand why she'd hidden such a significant part of her past. But another part, the part that loved her, that trusted the life they'd built, urged him to let it go. Maybe it really was just a college phase, as Laura had said. Maybe Caitlin was just stirring the pot for her own amusement. Nick rubbed his temples, trying to silence the doubts that gnawed at him like termites. The sound of laughter broke his thoughts. Laura and Caitlin descended the stairs, their voices light and carefree, as if last night's bombshell had been a mere footnote. Laura, dressed in a casual sweater, looked refreshed, her blonde hair tied back. Caitlin, in a fitted blouse that hugged her frame, carried herself with the same effortless confidence that had unsettled Nick from the moment she arrived. "Morning, honey," Laura said, planting a quick kiss on Nick's cheek before heading to the coffee maker. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Nick replied, his voice neutral. He watched Caitlin, who slid into a chair across from him, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of amusement. "Rough night?" Caitlin asked, her tone teasing but laced with something sharper, like she knew exactly why he'd been tossing and turning. "Just a lot on my mind," Nick said, forcing a smile. He sipped his cold coffee, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. Laura, oblivious to the undercurrent, chattered about plans for the day, a walk through the nearby park, maybe a stop at a local cafe. Caitlin nodded along, but her attention seemed split, her gaze drifting to Nick every so often. Each look felt like a challenge, a silent dare to ask the questions he was holding back. He gripped his mug tighter, his knuckles whitening. Breakfast passed in a haze of small talk, But Nick's unease grew with every shared laugh between Laura and Caitlin. Their familiarity, the way they finished each other's sentences, made him feel like an intruder in his own home. When Laura stepped outside to check the mail, Nick seized the moment, turning to Caitlin. "So, what's your deal?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "You show up out of nowhere, drop that you and Laura dated, and act like it's no big deal. What are you really here for?" Caitlin leaned back, her smile unfazed. "Wow, straight to the point," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm just visiting an old friend, Nick. Is that so hard to believe?" "You're not just visiting," Nick said, his voice steady but firm. "You're digging up the past, and I want to know why." Caitlin's eyes narrowed, but her smile didn't waver. "Maybe Laura's the one you should be asking," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "She's the one who invited me here. Maybe there's something she's not telling you." Before Nick could respond, Laura returned, a stack of envelopes in hand. The tension dissipated as she launched into a story about a neighbor's lost cat, but Caitlin's words lingered in Nick's mind like a splinter. Was Laura hiding more than just her college romance? And if so, why had she invited Caitlin into their lives now? The day dragged on, each moment heavy with unspoken questions. In the afternoon, while Laura was in the shower, Nick found himself alone in the house, Caitlin having stepped out for a supposed work call. Restless, he wandered into Laura's home office, a small room cluttered with marketing books and post-it notes. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, reassurance, maybe, or proof that his suspicions were baseless. As he straightened a stack of papers, a small wooden box tucked behind a monitor caught his eye. His heart pounded as he opened it, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was Laura's, the paper yellowed with age. Against his better judgment, he untied the bundle and scanned the first letter. It was addressed to Caitlin, dated their senior year at Illinois. "I've never felt this way before," Laura had written. "You make everything brighter." Nick's chest tightened as he read on, each word painting a picture of a love he'd never known existed. But the final letter stopped him cold. Dated a month before graduation, it was shorter, the tone raw with hurt. "How could you do this, Caitlin? I trusted you, and you threw it away for her." Nick's hands trembled as he pieced it together. Caitlin had cheated on Laura, breaking her heart. The betrayal explained why Laura had buried this part of her past, but didn't explain why Caitlin was here now, stirring up old wounds. He shoved the letters back into the box, his mind racing. Was Caitlin here to make amends? Or was she playing a different game? The front door clicked open, and Nick froze, hearing Caitlin's voice call out. He slipped out of the office, his heart hammering, and busied himself in the kitchen as she entered. "Miss me?" Caitlin said, tossing her phone onto the counter with a grin. Nick didn't answer, his jaw tight. Her casual demeanor only fueled his suspicion. When Laura joined them, suggesting they head to the park, Nick agreed, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. But as they walked, Caitlin's presence felt like a shadow, her every word and glance laced with intent. At one point, she brushed past him, her hand grazing his arm, a fleeting touch that could have been accidental but felt anything but. Back home, as Laura and Caitlin prepared dinner together, Nick watched from the living room, his mind a tangle of doubt and curiosity. Caitlin's betrayal in college should have made her the villain, but her confidence, her ease with Laura, stirred something unsettling in him. Not just anger, but a flicker of fascination he didn't want to admit. He hated himself for it, but the more he learned about her, the more he wanted to know. As night fell, Nick lay beside Laura, the distance between them palpable. Caitlin's arrival had cracked open a door to a past he didn't understand, and now he stood at the threshold, unsure whether to step through or slam it shut. One thing was clear, Caitlin wasn't just a guest. She was a catalyst, and whatever happened next would change everything. The Chicago sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain, as Nick sat in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. The house was quiet, Laura out running errands, and Caitlin upstairs, supposedly working on project. The past few days had been a slow-burning fuse, each moment with Caitlin tightening the knot in Nick's chest. The letters he'd found in Laura's office, proof of Caitlin's betrayal in college, had shifted his perspective. Caitlin wasn't just a ghost from Laura's past. She was a threat, her presence a calculated move to disrupt their lives. Nick's initial shock had hardened into resolve. He wasn't about to let her unravel his marriage. The letters had been a gut punch, but they'd also lit a fire. Caitlin's college infidelity explained Laura's secrecy, but her return now, with her sly smiles and loaded comments, suggested an agenda. Nick's mind replayed their park walk yesterday, Caitlin's hand brushing his arm, her eyes lingering just long enough to unsettle him. Was she toying with him, or was she after Laura? Either way, Nick needed answers and a plan. He opened his phone and texted Mike, his friend and a lawyer who'd handled contract for Nick's firm. Need your advice. Got a situation. Can we talk? Mike replied within minutes. Call me. Nick stepped onto the back porch, the cool air sharpening his focus, and dialed. All right, man, what's going on? Mike's voice was steady, no nonsense. Nick hesitated, then laid it out. The bombshell about Laura and Caitlin's college romance. The letters. Caitlin's provocative behavior. I think she's trying to mess with us, he said, keeping his voice low. Maybe even break us up. I need to protect Laura, but I don't want to blow this up in her face. Mike listened, then spoke carefully. Sounds like Caitlin's playing a game, but you need evidence, not assumptions. Check her social media, see if she's got a pattern of stirring trouble. Maybe talk to her colleagues, discreetly. If she's crossing lines, you'll need something concrete to confront her with. Nick nodded, the plan taking shape. And if I find something, don't go vigilante, Mike warned. Show Laura the truth, let her decide. If Caitlin's manipulating her, she's the one who needs to see it. Nick ended the call, his pulse quickening. He wasn't a detective, but he could dig. Back inside, he opened his laptop and started with Caitlin's social media. Her profiles were public, polished with photos of glitzy events and cryptic captions. A few posts hinted at messy breakups, with comments from friends warning others to steer clear. Nick's jaw tightened. Mike was right about patterns. Then he found it. A recent message thread on a mutual friend's post, where Caitlin had replied to Laura's comment with a heart eyes emoji and miss our late nights. The reply was weeks old, before Caitlin's visit was even mentioned. Nick's stomach churned. This wasn't a spontaneous trip. Caitlin had been laying groundwork. He needed more. Using a burner email, Nick messaged a contact listed on Caitlin's event planning website, posing as a potential client. The response came fast. Caitlin's great at her job, but watch out, she's got a rep for mixing business with personal drama. It wasn't hard proof, but it was a start. Upstairs, the floor creaked. Nick closed his laptop as Caitlin appeared, her hair damp from a shower, a towel slung over her shoulder. Working hard or hardly working, she asked, her tone playful but her eyes sharp, like she sensed his unease. Just wrapping up? Nick said, keeping his voice even. You? Same, she said, leaning against the doorway. Though I'm thinking of convincing Laura for a girls' night out. Relive the old days, you know? Her smile was a blade, testing him. Nick's grip on his phone tightened. Sure, he said, forcing a shrug. Just don't keep her out too late. Caitlin's laugh was soft, almost mocking. No promises. She sauntered back upstairs, leaving Nick with a sinking feeling. He had to act fast. That evening, Laura returned, arms full of grocery bags. Nick helped her unpack, watching her closely. She seemed lighter, humming as she sorted produce, but there was a nervous edge to her movements. Over dinner, Caitlin dominated the conversation, reminiscing about college bars and late-night drives. Laura laughed, but her eyes flicked to Nick, like she was gauging his reaction. After dessert, Nick excused himself to the garage, pretending to check his tools. Instead, he pulled up Caitlin's latest text to Laura, which he'd glimpsed when Laura left her phone unlocked. One message, sent that morning, stopped him cold. You deserve better than settling, L. Remember how free we were? The words were a dagger, confirming Nick's worst fears. Caitlin was trying to pull Laura away. He leaned against the workbench, his breath shallow. Confronting Caitlin now would be messy, emotional. He needed to be smart, to expose her without alienating Laura. Mike's advice echoed, show Laura the truth. Nick returned to the house, his resolve stealing. Tomorrow, he'd gather the final pieces, screenshots, maybe a call to Caitlin's ex-colleague who'd hinted at her manipulative streak. As he climbed into bed, Laura was already half asleep, her back to him. Nick stared at the ceiling, the weight of his discovery pressing down. Caitlin's game was clear now, but the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. If he mishandled this, he could lose Laura, not to Caitlin, but to the fracture of trust between them. Yet doing nothing wasn't an option. Caitlin's presence was a ticking bomb, and Nick was determined to defuse it. The next morning, over coffee, Caitlin dropped another hint, her voice casual but pointed. Laura, We should plan a trip, just the two of us. Like that summer in Michigan. Laura smiled, but Nick saw the hesitation in her eyes. He forced a nod, playing along, but inside, he was mapping his next move. Caitlin thought she held the cards, but Nick was building a hand she wouldn't see coming. By the time this weekend ended, he'd make sure the truth was out, and Caitlin was gone. The dining room of the Harper home glowed under the soft light of a chandelier. The table set for a final dinner with Caitlin. Nick sat across from Laura, his hand steady but his heart racing. Tonight was the reckoning. After days of Caitlin's subtle provocations and his own quiet investigation, Nick had gathered enough to expose her. Screenshots of her manipulative texts, a colleague's email detailing her history of stirring drama, and the old letters from Laura's college days, all formed a case he couldn't ignore. Caitlin's plan to lure Laura away was clear, but Nick's goal wasn't vengeance. He wanted truth for Laura's sake and their marriage. Laura, oblivious to the storm brewing, passed a bowl of mashed potatoes, her smile warm but strained. Caitlin, at the head of the table, was her usual charismatic self, spinning a story about a chaotic event she'd planned in New York. Her laughter filled the room, but Nick caught the way her eyes flicked to Laura, searching for a reaction. He'd seen that look before, calculating like a chess player sizing up a board. Nick took a sip of water, steadying himself. He'd rehearsed this moment with Mike, his lawyer friend, who'd urged him to stay calm and let the evidence speak. Confronting Caitlin directly risked pushing Laura away, but silence wasn't an option. The weight of the past week, Laura's hidden past, Caitlin's veiled taunts, the letters revealing her college betrayal, had brought Nick to this edge. He wouldn't let Caitlin walk away unscathed. "Great roast, Nick," Caitlin said, her smile sharp as she cut into her meat. "You're a keeper." "Thanks," Nick said, his tone even. He glanced at Laura, who was pushing peas around her plate, her gaze distant. "Now or never." "Actually, Caitlin, there's something I've been meaning to bring up." Laura looked up, her brow furrowing. Caitlin's fork paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, though her smile held. "Oh," she said, leaning back. "What's that?" Nick pulled his phone from his pocket, his movements deliberate. "I've been doing some digging," he said, his voice calm but firm. "About you, Caitlin. About why you're really here." Laura's fork clattered against her plate. "Nick, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tight. Nick held up a hand, his eyes locked on Caitlin. "Laura, just hear me out. I found some things, messages, emails, that paint a different picture of Caitlin's visit." He opened his phone and slid it across the table, the screen showing a screenshot of Caitlin's text to Laura. "You deserve better than settling, L. Remember how free we were?" Laura's face paled as she read it. Caitlin's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, letting out a light laugh. "Come on, Nick, it's just a text. Old friends reminisce. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" Nick said, his voice steady. He tapped the screen, pulling up the email from Caitlin's ex-colleague. "This says you've got a history of manipulating people, Caitlin. Using charm to get what you want, then leaving chaos behind." He turned to Laura, softening his tone. "And then there's the letters, Laura, the ones you wrote in college. They show Caitlin broke your trust back then. She's doing it again now." Laura's eyes widened, her hand trembling as she reached for the phone. "You went through my letters?" she whispered, hurt flashing across her face. "I had to," Nick said, his voice cracking. "I needed to understand why she's here, why you never told me about her. Laura, she's trying to pull you away from us." Caitlin stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her charm slipping. "Laura, you know me. I can't catch up, not to." "Stop," Laura said, her voice sharp. She stared at the phone, scrolling through the messages, her expression shifting from shock to betrayal. "You sent this 2 weeks ago, Caitlin, before you even asked to stay here. Were you planning this all along?" Caitlin's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. The silence was damning. Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she turned to Nick, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I want to be sure," Nick said, reaching for her hand. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't let her manipulate you." Laura pulled her hand back, standing abruptly. "I need air," she said, her voice shaking. She walked out, the back door slamming behind her. Nick's heart sank, but he turned to Caitlin, who was gathering her things. "You should go," he said, his tone cold. "You've done enough." Caitlin's eyes flashed with defiance, but she nodded, grabbing her bag. "You think you've won, Nick? Laura's never going to trust you after this." She stormed out, her car peeling away minutes later. Nick found Laura on the porch, staring at the darkening sky. Rain had started to fall, a soft patter against the roof. He sat beside her, the silence heavy. "I'm sorry I went through your things," he said. I couldn't lose you." Laura wiped her eyes, her voice raw. "I should have told you about Caitlin. It wasn't just a phase. She meant a lot to me. When she cheated, it broke me. I buried it because I was ashamed of how much it hurt." She paused, her gaze distant. "But you should have trusted me, Nick. Not played detective behind my back." Nick nodded, guilt twisting in his gut. "I know. I messed up, but I saw her trying to pull you away, and I panicked." Laura sighed, her shoulders slumping. "She almost did," she admitted. "Her texts, her stories, they made me miss who I was back then. But I chose you, Nick. I've always chosen you." They sat in silence, the rain growing heavier. Nick took her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. "Can we fix this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Laura squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. "I want to try. Maybe we should see someone. A counselor." Nick nodded, relief washing over him. "Whatever it takes." The next week, word spread through their social circle about Caitlin's manipulative behavior, her reputation taking a hit as colleagues distanced themselves. Nick and Laura started therapy, the sessions raw but hopeful. Caitlin's shadow lingered, but Nick felt lighter, knowing he'd chosen truth over vengeance. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and they'd fight for it.